Hey, welcome to the English Podcast Lab. I'm Mike, and today we're going deep on a skill that's absolutely crucial for learning any language, especially English: listening. I know what you might be thinking. Listening.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty basic, but trust me, there's a lot more to it than meets the ear. And to help us unpack all the fascinating layers of listening, I've got Sarah here with me, a true whiz when it comes to communication.
Well, thank you for the warm welcome, Mike. It's great to be here and to chat with you about this often overlooked skill.
Okay, so before we get into nitty-gritty, I want to paint a picture for you.
Okay.
Imagine this. You're in a conversation, but instead of really tuning in, you're kind of zoning out, maybe thinking about what you're going to have for dinner or scrolling through your phone. And then suddenly, the other person asks you a question about what they just said, and you're completely lost.
Oh, yeah.
Been there. I know I have.
We've all been there. It's so easy to fall into the trap of passive hearing, where we're technically absorbing sounds but not truly engaging with the speaker, and that's where the magic of active listening comes in.
Okay, so active listening. What's the big deal?
Well, think of it this way. Active listening is like turning up the volume on your attention. It's about being fully present in the moment, not just with your ears, but with your entire being. You're focused on the speaker's words, their tone of voice, their body language, all those subtle cues that add layers of meaning to what they're saying.
So it's about more than just understanding the words themselves. It's about connecting with the speaker on a deeper level.
Exactly. And when you actively listen, you're not just absorbing information.
Right.
You're building rapport, showing respect, and creating a space for genuine connection.
That makes so much sense. But let's be honest, it's easier said than done, right? I mean, our world is full of distractions. Our phones are buzzing. Our to-do lists are swirling in our minds. It's like our brains are on constant overdrive.
Absolutely. We live in a world of information overload, and it's easy to let those distractions get the best of us. But here's the thing. Active listening is a skill, and just like any skill, it takes practice.
So where do we even begin? What are some practical steps we can take to become better active listeners, especially when it comes to learning English?
Well, one simple but powerful technique is something called mindful listening.
Mindful listening. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
It's about bringing your full awareness to the present moment without judgment. You're simply observing the sounds, the words, the rhythm of the speaker's voice, letting go of any internal chatter or distractions.
So it's like hitting the pause button on our busy minds and just allowing ourselves to be fully present with the speaker.
Precisely. And here's a little trick that can help. Try focusing on the speaker's breath. Notice the inhales and exhales, the pauses between phrases.
Okay.
It can help anchor you to the present moment and enhance your focus.
Wow, that's a really cool tip. I'm definitely going to try that. Now, what about those pesky distractions we were talking about earlier? How do we deal with those when we're trying to actively listen, especially when we're learning English?
Well, the first step is to become aware of your personal distraction triggers. Is it your phone? Is it your to-do list? Is it that persistent inner critic that loves to chime in with judgments?
Yeah.
Once you know what your triggers are, you can start to develop strategies for managing them.
So it's like knowing your enemy, right? Once you identify those distractions, you can come up with a plan to combat them.
Exactly. And sometimes it's as simple as putting your phone on silent or finding a quiet space to practice your listening. Other times it might involve a little more mental discipline, like gently guiding your attention back to the speaker whenever you notice your mind wandering.
And I imagine this is even more important when you're listening to English, a language you're still learning, because every word, every nuance matters.
Absolutely. When you're actively listening to English, you're not just trying to decipher the words. You're immersing yourself in the sounds, the rhythms, the patterns of the language. You're training your ear to recognize those subtle differences in pronunciation, intonation, and stress that can completely change the meaning of a sentence.
That's fascinating. So active listening is not just about comprehension. It's about absorbing the music of the language, the way it flows and ebbs.
Exactly. And the more you practice active listening, the more natural and effortless it will become.
Okay, so we've talked about mindful listening and managing distractions. What are some other techniques that can help us become more active listeners, especially when it comes to learning English?
Well, one technique that I find incredibly helpful is something called reflecting.
Reflecting. Okay, I'm all ears.
It's essentially summarizing or paraphrasing what the speaker has said to ensure that you've understood them correctly. And it's not just about parroting back their words verbatim. It's about capturing the essence of their message in your own words.
So it's like holding up a mirror to the speaker, showing them that you're really listening and that you're making an effort to understand their perspective.
That's a great analogy. And reflecting is incredibly powerful because it demonstrates empathy, encourages the speaker to elaborate, and helps clarify any misunderstandings.
I can see how that would be especially useful when learning English, because it allows you to check your comprehension and to practice using the language in a meaningful way.
Exactly. And reflecting doesn't have to be formal or complicated. You can use simple phrases like, "So what you're saying is," or "If I understand correctly, you're feeling."
Okay, reflecting. Got it. Now let's talk about another challenge that comes with learning English. Different accents. It's amazing how much the same language can sound completely different depending on where someone's from.
It's true. English is spoken all over the world, and there are countless regional accents and dialects, each with its own unique pronunciation patterns and even vocabulary.
So how can we train our ears to understand all those different accents?
Well, the key is exposure. The more you listen to different accents, the more familiar your ear will become with the subtle variations in pronunciation and intonation.
So it's like anything else, practice makes perfect.
Exactly. And the great thing is, there are so many resources available for listening to different English accents. You can watch movies and TV shows from different English-speaking countries, listen to podcasts hosted by people from various backgrounds, and even use language learning apps that offer accent training exercises.
And I imagine that being able to understand different accents is crucial for effective communication, not just for learning English, but also for navigating our increasingly interconnected world.
Absolutely. Being able to communicate with people from diverse linguistic backgrounds is a valuable skill in today's globalized society. And active listening, combined with exposure to different accents, can help you bridge those linguistic gaps and build stronger connections with people from all over the world.
Now, what about nonverbal cues? How do those play into active listening, especially when it comes to learning English?
Nonverbal cues are a fascinating aspect of communication, and they can often convey more meaning than words themselves.
It's like that saying, actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. And when you're actively listening, you're paying attention to the speaker's entire communication package. Their words, their tone of voice, their facial expressions, their body language.
Right.
All of these elements work together to create a tapestry of meaning.
So it's about tuning into those subtle signals that can reveal a lot about the speaker's emotions, intentions, and even their cultural background.
Precisely. And when it comes to learning English, paying attention to nonverbal cues can be incredibly helpful because they can often provide context and clarification for the spoken words.
So even if you don't understand every single word, you can still get a sense of the overall message by paying attention to the speaker's nonverbal communication.
That's right. And the more you practice observing nonverbal cues, the more tuned you'll become to the subtle nuances of human communication.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Mindful listening, reflecting, managing distractions, understanding different accents, and tuning in to nonverbal cues. It's amazing how much goes into active listening.
It's true. Active listening is a multifaceted skill that involves our minds, our bodies, and our hearts. And it's a skill that can be learned and developed with practice.
And I think it's a skill that's absolutely essential for anyone who wants to learn English effectively and to connect with others on a deeper level.
I couldn't agree more. Active listening is the foundation of meaningful communication, and it's a gift we can give ourselves and others.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to challenge you, dear listener, to put some of these active listening techniques into practice in your everyday life.
Pay attention to your own listening habits.
Notice how you respond in conversations.
And see if you can identify areas where you could be a more active and engaged listener.
You might be surprised by what you discover about yourself and the people around you.
Now, before we move on, I want to delve into another powerful technique that can be particularly helpful for English learners. Shadowing.
Shadowing? That sounds interesting. What exactly is shadowing?
Imagine this. You're listening to a recording of a native English speaker, and as you listen, you try to imitate their speech as closely as possible, almost like you're their shadow. You're mimicking their pronunciation, their intonation, their rhythm, everything.
So it's like becoming a vocal chameleon.
That's a great way to put it. And while it might sound a bit strange at first, shadowing is an incredibly effective technique for improving your pronunciation, fluency, and overall listening comprehension.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does shadowing actually work?
Well, first you need to choose a recording of a native English speaker that you find interesting and engaging. It could be a podcast, an audiobook, a TED Talk, or even a scene from a movie or TV show.
And I imagine it's helpful to choose a recording that has a transcript available so you can follow along with the words as you listen.
Absolutely. That way, if you hear a word or phrase that you're not sure about, you can easily look it up and check the pronunciation.
So once you've chosen your recording and you have the transcript handy, what's the next step?
Start by listening to a short segment of the recording, maybe a sentence or two at a time. Really focus on the speaker's pronunciation and intonation.
So it's not just about repeating the words, but about embodying the speaker's voice and style.
Exactly. Try to match their rhythm, their pauses, their emphasis, all those subtle elements that contribute to their unique way of speaking. Then pause the recording and try to repeat what you just heard, imitating the speaker as closely as possible.
And it's okay if you don't get it perfect the first time. It's all about practice and repetition.
Absolutely. And as you become more comfortable, you can gradually increase the length of the segments you're shadowing.
And eventually you'll be able to shadow entire conversations or even speeches.
It's a powerful technique, and the more you practice it, the more you'll notice improvements in your own pronunciation, fluency, and overall listening comprehension.
Now, what about those times when we're trying to actively listen, but our minds just won't cooperate? It's like our thoughts are on a runaway train, and we can't seem to get them back on track.
Ah, yes, the wandering mind. It's something we all experience, and it can be especially frustrating when we're trying to focus on listening to English.
Yeah.
But here's the good news. There are techniques we can use to tame that runaway train and bring our attention back to the present moment.
So what are some of those mind-taming techniques?
Well, one technique that's particularly helpful is called anchoring. It's about finding a sensory cue that you can use to ground yourself in the present moment whenever you notice your mind drifting.
So it's like creating a mental anchor that keeps you from floating away into the sea of distractions.
Exactly. And this anchor can be anything that brings your attention back to your senses. The feeling of your feet on the floor, the coolness of your breath as you inhale, the sound of the speaker's voice.
So whenever you feel your mind wandering, you can simply focus on that anchor for a few moments until you feel more grounded and present.
Exactly. And the more you practice anchoring, the easier it will become to redirect your attention and to stay focused on the speaker's message.
That's a really helpful technique. I can see how that could be useful for anyone who's trying to improve their listening skills, not just for learning English.
Absolutely. Anchoring is a valuable tool for anyone who wants to cultivate greater presence and focus in their daily life.
Well, I feel like we've already uncovered so much about the power of active listening, and we've only just scratched the surface.
It's true. There's so much more to explore, and I'm excited to continue our deep dive into the world of listening in our next episode.
I can't wait. Now, dear listener, before we move on, I want to leave you with a little challenge.
Pay attention to how you listen in your everyday life.
Notice those moments when your mind starts to wander.
And see if you can use some of the techniques we've discussed today to gently guide your attention back to the present moment.
I think you'll be amazed by how even small shifts in your listening habits can make a big difference in your understanding of the world and your connections with the people around you.
You know, we've been talking about active listening in a general sense, but I think it's important to acknowledge that listening in a language you're still learning, like English, comes with its own unique set of challenges.
Absolutely. It's like trying to solve a puzzle while the pieces are still being shuffled.
That's a great way to put it. One of the biggest hurdles English learners face is the sheer speed at which native speakers talk. It can be like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Right.
Words seem to blend together, and it can be tough to catch every single syllable.
I can definitely see how that would be overwhelming, especially when you're still getting used to the sounds and rhythms of the language.
Exactly. And then there's the added challenge of different accents. Think about it.
Right.
British English, American English, Australian English, Indian English, they all have their own unique pronunciation patterns and even vocabulary differences.
It's like English has its own little United Nations of accents.
That's a great way to think about it. And for learners who are only exposed to one particular accent, it can be quite a shock to encounter another.
So what advice would you give to English learners who are struggling with these challenges?
Well, first and foremost, be patient with yourself. It takes time and consistent effort to develop strong listening skills in any language, especially one as diverse as English.
It's like learning to play a musical instrument. You wouldn't expect to be a virtuoso overnight. It takes practice, dedication, and a whole lot of grace for those inevitable fumbles along the way.
Exactly. And speaking of practice, one of the best things you can do is to immerse yourself in the language as much as possible. Listen to English music, watch English movies and TV shows, and even listen to English podcasts while you're working out or doing chores. The key is to surround yourself with the sounds of the language and let your brain start to recognize those patterns naturally.
It's like creating a soundtrack for your life. But instead of just listening passively, you're actively engaging with the language and absorbing those nuances.
Precisely. And don't be afraid to use subtitles at first. It can be a fantastic bridge between what you're hearing and what you're understanding.
It's like having a cheat sheet for your ears. And as you become more comfortable, you can gradually wean yourself off the subtitles and challenge yourself to listen without that visual crutch.
Exactly. It's all about setting realistic goals and gradually increasing the difficulty level as your skills improve.
Now let's talk about some strategies for actively engaging with those listening materials. We talked about shadowing earlier, but what are some other techniques that can help us squeeze every drop of learning out of those English podcasts, movies, and shows?
One technique that's often overlooked, but incredibly powerful, is simply paying attention to the sounds of the language.
Gus, break that down for us. What do you mean by paying attention to the sounds?
It's about going beyond just trying to understand the meaning of the words and really tuning in to the individual sounds, the intonation patterns, the rhythm of the speech.
So it's like listening to English as if it were music, appreciating the melody and the flow of the language.
Exactly. And when you start to listen to English this way, you'll notice all sorts of fascinating things. You'll start to hear the subtle differences in pronunciation between different accents. You'll begin to recognize the way intonation can change the meaning of a sentence. And you'll even start to pick up on the emotional undertones that are conveyed through the speaker's voice.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's like you're unlocking a secret code hidden within the language.
It is a bit like that.
Uh-huh.
And the more you listen to English in this way, the more natural and effortless it will become for you to understand and speak the language.
So it's not just about cramming vocabulary words or memorizing grammar rules. It's about developing an ear for the music of the language, the way it dances and flows.
Precisely. And it's a skill that anyone can develop with practice.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another challenge that English learners often face dealing with distractions while listening. It's so easy to get sidetracked by our phones, our thoughts, or even just the noises around us. It's like our brains are constantly bombarded by shiny objects, vying for our attention.
Distractions are definitely a formidable foe when it comes to effective listening. And it can be particularly challenging for English learners who are already working hard to process the language.
So how do we win this battle against distractions? What are some strategies for staying focused when our minds are begging for a break?
Well, I think the first step is to create a listening environment that's as distraction-free as possible. It might mean silencing your phone, closing your laptop, finding a quiet corner where you can tune out the world for a bit.
It's like creating a little sanctuary for your ears.
Yeah.
A space where you can fully immerse yourself in the sounds of the language without those pesky interruptions.
Exactly. And if you can't completely eliminate distractions, try using noise-canceling headphones to minimize the external noise and create a more focused listening experience.
And what about those internal distractions, those thoughts that seem to pop up out of nowhere, like uninvited guests at a party? How do we deal with those?
Ah, yes, those mental chatterboxes can be quite persistent. But here's the thing, you don't have to fight them. Simply acknowledge their presence and gently guide your attention back to the speaker's voice.
So it's like saying to those thoughts, hey, I see you there, but I'm busy right now. I'll catch up with you later.
Exactly. It's about treating those thoughts with kindness and curiosity rather than getting caught up in their whirlwind.
And I imagine this skill of gently redirecting your attention is something that gets easier with practice, just like any other aspect of active listening.
Absolutely. The more you practice bringing your attention back to the present moment, the more effortless it will become.
Now let's talk about some specific types of listening materials that can be particularly beneficial for English learners. We touched on this briefly earlier, but I'd love to dive a little deeper.
Absolutely. One resource that I always recommend is podcasts. They're like little nuggets of audio gold, offering a wealth of information and entertainment on a wide range of topics. And the best part is most podcasts are free and easily accessible online.
It's like having a personal library of audio learning at your fingertips. And I love that you can find podcasts on pretty much any topic imaginable, from current events to history to science to pop culture to personal development. There's something for everyone.
That's right. And because podcasts are often conversational in style, you get to hear native English speakers using natural, everyday language.
It's like eavesdropping on a fascinating conversation, but instead of being rude, you're actually learning something valuable.
Exactly. And they often use idiomatic expressions and slang, which can really help you expand your vocabulary and get a feel for how the language is actually spoken in different contexts.
It's like getting a crash course in English slang, but without having to hang out in a dimly lit pub for hours on end.
Another great thing about podcasts is that you can adjust the playback speed. So if you're finding a particular podcast too fast, you can slow it down until you're more comfortable. And as your listening skills improve, you can gradually increase the speed until you're able to understand native speakers at their normal pace.
It's like having a personal trainer for your ears, helping you build those listening muscles gradually.
Now let's talk about another fantastic resource for English learners: audiobooks.
Audiobooks. I love them. It's like having a professional storyteller whisking you away to another world.
Exactly. And just like podcasts, audiobooks can help you improve your listening comprehension and vocabulary, but they also offer a few unique benefits.
For one, audiobooks are often longer than podcasts, which means you can really immerse yourself in the language for an extended period of time.
That's right. And because audiobooks tell a story, they can be incredibly engaging and captivating, which makes the learning process feel less like work and more like pleasure.
And you can really get lost in the world of the story, letting the language wash over you and seep into your subconscious.
And audiobooks can expose you to a wider range of vocabulary and grammatical structures than you might encounter in everyday conversation, which can be incredibly enriching for your language development.
And if you're someone who loves to read, but you struggle to find the time, audiobooks can be a great way to fit more literature into your busy life. You can listen to an audiobook while you're commuting, working out, doing chores, or even just relaxing at home.
Exactly. It's like multitasking for your brain. And just like with podcasts, you can adjust the playback speed of audiobooks to match your listening comprehension level.
Now we can't forget about YouTube. It's become such a ubiquitous part of our lives, and it's also a treasure trove of authentic English content.
Oh, absolutely. YouTube is a goldmine for English learners. You can find everything from music videos and movie trailers to educational videos, vlogs, comedy sketches, and even full-length documentaries. And just like with podcasts and audiobooks, you can find YouTube videos on literally any topic that interests you.
It's like having access to an endless library of video content all in English.
Yeah.
And what I love about YouTube is that it's so visually engaging. You're not just listening to the language, you're also seeing it in action, which can be incredibly helpful for understanding context and picking up on nonverbal cues.
That's a great point. And many YouTube videos have subtitles available, which can be a huge help for English learners, especially at the beginning stages.
It's like having a safety net for your ears, knowing that you can always glance at the subtitles if you miss a word or phrase.
And you can even slow down the playback speed of YouTube videos to make them easier to understand.
I love that feature.
Yeah.
It's like having a remote control for the speed of the language, allowing you to adjust it to your comfort level.
And one of the things that makes YouTube so unique is that it's incredibly interactive. You can leave comments, subscribe to channels, and even create your own videos, which can be a fantastic way to practice your speaking and listening skills in a fun and engaging way.
It's like having a global stage where you can share your thoughts and ideas with the world, all in English.
Now, with all of these fantastic resources available, it can be a bit overwhelming to know where to start.
Especially for English learners who are just beginning their listening journey. What advice would you give them for choosing the right materials for their level and interests?
One important tip is to start with materials that are slightly below your current level of English. You want to challenge yourself without getting frustrated. If you're constantly having to pause the recording and look up words, it can become demotivating.
It's like trying to run a marathon before you've learned to walk. You're setting yourself up for exhaustion and disappointment.
Exactly. So choose materials that you can understand about 70–80% of the time without having to stop. And as your listening skills improve, you can gradually increase the difficulty level.
It's like leveling up in a video game, slowly but surely gaining those listening superpowers.
And another crucial tip is to choose materials that are genuinely interesting to you. If you're bored by the topic, you're less likely to pay attention and absorb the information.
Yeah, it's like trying to force yourself to eat broccoli when all you really want is pizza. It's just not going to be a pleasurable experience.
So think about your hobbies, your interests, your passions. There are bound to be podcasts, audiobooks, and YouTube videos out there that align with your interests, making the learning process feel less like a chore and more like a joyride.
And don't be afraid to experiment with different types of listening materials. You might be surprised by what you discover. Maybe you thought you hated history, but then you stumble upon a podcast that brings the past to life in a way you never imagined.
Exactly. Curiosity is your best friend when it comes to language learning, and don't be afraid to ask for recommendations from other English learners or teachers. They can point you in the direction of resources that they've found helpful and inspiring.
It's like having a personal guide in the vast jungle of English learning materials, helping you navigate through the thicket and find those hidden gems.
Now, before we move on to our final section, I want to touch on a skill that's closely intertwined with listening, and that's pronunciation.
Pronunciation. That elusive beast that can make or break your ability to be understood in English. What are some tips for taming this beast and improving our pronunciation?
Well, one of the most effective techniques is to pay close attention to the way native speakers pronounce words. You can do this by watching English movies and TV shows, listening to English podcasts and audiobooks, and even just eavesdropping on conversations in public places.
It's like becoming a pronunciation detective, listening for clues and patterns in the way native speakers shape their sounds.
Exactly. And when you hear a word that you're not sure how to pronounce, look it up in an online dictionary that has audio pronunciations.
Many dictionaries now have both British and American pronunciations, so you can choose the accent that you're most comfortable with or that's most relevant to your context.
And once you've learned the correct pronunciation of a word, practice saying it out loud several times. You can even record yourself and listen back to see how you sound.
It's like having your own personal pronunciation coach, but instead of paying an hourly rate, you're just using your phone.
Exactly. And if you're really struggling with a particular sound, you can find pronunciation tutorials online or even work with a speech therapist.
Now, let's talk about another element of spoken English that can be tricky for learners. Intonation. What exactly is intonation, and why is it so important?
Intonation is the music of language. It's the rise and fall of our voices as we speak, and it plays a huge role in conveying meaning, emotion, and even intention.
So it's not just about saying the right words, it's about saying them in the right way with the right melody and rhythm.
Precisely. And in English, intonation can completely change the meaning of a sentence. For example, a rising intonation at the end of a sentence indicates a question, while a falling intonation indicates a statement.
And a flat intonation can make you sound like a bored robot, even if you're saying the most interesting things in the world.
Exactly. So it's crucial to pay attention to intonation when you're listening to English and to try to imitate natural intonation patterns when you're speaking.
Okay, so how do we train our ears to recognize and reproduce those subtle shifts in intonation?
Well, just like with pronunciation, one of the best ways to improve your intonation is to listen to native speakers and pay attention to how they use their voices. Listen to the way their voices rise and fall, the way they emphasize certain words and phrases, the way they use pauses to create dramatic effect.
It's like studying the score of a symphony, noticing how the composer uses different instruments and dynamics to create a rich and layered soundscape.
That's a beautiful analogy. And just like a musician practices their scales and arpeggios, you can practice your intonation by imitating native speakers and experimenting with different patterns. You can also find intonation tutorials online or work with a speech coach who can help you identify areas where you might need to adjust your pitch or rhythm.
And I imagine that as your intonation becomes more natural and expressive, you'll not only be better understood by native English speakers, but you'll also find it easier to understand them because you'll be more attuned to those subtle nuances of spoken English.
Absolutely. Intonation is like a secret language within language, a way of adding depth and nuance to our communication. And the more you master this secret language, the more fluent and confident you'll become in English.
Now, before we move on to our final section, where we'll explore how active listening can help you shine in specific situations like job interviews and presentations, I want to share a fun and engaging activity that can help you improve both your pronunciation and intonation. Tongue twisters.
Ah, yes, those delightful little word puzzles that tie your tongue in knots.
Exactly. Tongue twisters are phrases that are designed to be tricky to say quickly and correctly because they contain a lot of similar sounds.
They're like little pronunciation obstacle courses for your tongue.
Exactly. And they can be a lot of fun to practice with friends or family.
And they're not just for kids. Tongue twisters can be a valuable tool for English learners of all levels, helping them to improve their articulation, fluency, and rhythm.
So what are some of your favorite tongue twisters?
Oh, there's so many good ones. One classic is She Sells Seashells by the Seashore.
That one always gets me.
Another one is Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers.
Okay, try saying that one 5 times fast.
And if you're feeling really ambitious, you can try, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
I think I just pulled a muscle in my tongue just thinking about saying that one.
But seriously, tongue twisters are a great way to practice your pronunciation and intonation in a fun and playful way. And they can be a great way to warm up your vocal cords before a presentation or a job interview.
So, dear listener, why not give them a try? Challenge yourself to master a few tongue twisters and see how it impacts your pronunciation and fluency. You might be surprised by how much fun you have along the way.
Now, I think it's time to move on to our final section, where we'll explore how active listening can be your secret weapon for success in those high-stakes situations that can often make our palms sweat and our hearts race.
You're talking about those moments where effective communication can make all the difference. Job interviews, presentations, negotiations, the kind of scenarios that can either launch us towards success or send us spiraling into a pit of self-doubt.
Exactly. And while it might seem counterintuitive, listening rather than speaking is often the key to shining in these situations.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. How can listening, that seemingly passive act, actually help us stand out and succeed in those high-pressure moments?
Those are powerful questions to reflect on, and I think the answers might surprise us.
I agree, because I have a feeling that many of us underestimate the profound impact listening can have on our lives, not just in terms of learning English, but also in terms of how we connect with the world and the people around us.
It's true. We often think of communication as being all about speaking, about expressing ourselves, about getting our point across. But what if true communication starts with listening?
What if by truly listening to others, we open ourselves up to a whole new world of understanding, empathy, and connection?
It's a radical idea, isn't it, to shift our focus from speaking to listening, from broadcasting to receiving.
But I think it's an idea worth exploring, because when we truly listen, we're not just absorbing information, we're creating a space for the other person to feel heard, to feel seen, to feel valued.
And that feeling of being heard, of being understood, is a powerful thing. It can build bridges, mend relationships, and even spark new ideas and collaborations.
It's like that saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And listening is the ultimate expression of caring.
It's about putting aside our own agendas, our own thoughts, our own judgments, and simply opening ourselves up to the other person's experience.
And who knows what we might discover in that space of deep listening. We might find common ground where we least expected it. We might learn something new that challenges our assumptions. We might even be surprised by the depth of connection we can create simply by listening with an open mind and an open heart.
It's a reminder that listening is not a passive act. It's an active, engaged, even courageous choice we make in every interaction.
It's a choice that can transform our relationships, our communities, and even our world.
Now, as we bring our deep dive into the world of listening to a close, I want to leave you, dear listener, with a few parting thoughts.
Remember that listening is a skill, and like any skill, it can be learned and honed with practice.
Don't be afraid to experiment with different listening techniques to find what works best for you.
Embrace those moments of linguistic awkwardness, those fumbles and mishearings, as opportunities for growth.
And most importantly, approach listening with a spirit of curiosity, empathy, and a genuine desire to connect with others.
Because when we listen, we not only learn about the world around us, we also learn about ourselves.
And who knows what amazing discoveries await us in that space of deep listening.
It's been an absolute pleasure exploring the world of listening with you. Your insights have been incredibly valuable.
The feeling is mutual. I've enjoyed our conversation immensely.
And to you, dear listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and practical tips that you can apply in your own life. Until next time, keep those ears open, those minds engaged, and those hearts receptive. Happy listening.